Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, there are many reasons why various members of Parliament come into this place or enter into politics. Child poverty has always been one of my main motivations. And it's helpful perhaps then in that regard that child poverty is one of those issues that is man-made. If we're looking for any issue where government can absolutely make a difference, it is an issue like child poverty. But how do you make that difference is the question that those who are interested in this area grapples with. Well, helpfully, the evidence, the numbers, the whole picture that is built out of those statistics tells us exactly what we as politicians need to do. That's what makes this area so frustrating. 260,000 children in need, and we know exactly what we need to do to help them. I would liken it also, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, to knowing where there might be a frequent car crash site, where there's continual accidents because there's a blind spot, and you go begging to government to fix the blind spot. Well, today, the government put up a sign. Now, let's be clear. Any extra support that is going into the homes of vulnerable families is absolutely welcomed. And this side of the House welcomes the fact that the government has today acknowledged, in my mind really for the first time, is today genuinely acknowledged that there is severe hardship and poverty in New Zealand. But now that they have acknowledged that there is a problem, they have an absolute obligation and responsibility to do more, because that's what the evidence tells us that we need to do. The first thing we know from the numbers is that measures of persistent poverty, where people for the longest period of a child's life experience hardship, is actually when that child is first born. And that is when we also know is the most critical time of a child's life. Now, probably instinct will tell you that that's most often going to be in the situation for sole parents, where it's harder for them to go into work because they're the sole caregiver, and that poverty then lasts generally for 3 to 4 years of that child's life in those earliest years. So yes, giving those families an extra $25 a week is a good thing, but let's also be realistic. For a family with one child, $25, great. 2 children, 3 children, that payment is per family, not per child, a point the Children Commissioner was right to make, and it is ultimately roughly a large pack of nappies for a week. Now, in Labour, we looked at the evidence too, and that is why when we developed the Best Start package, we thought we need to give those families $60 a week. We need to give it to them per child, and we need to make sure that it lasts for at least those first 3 years of that child's life. So that was what Best Start absolutely did. It was targeted, but it was more generous because that is what the evidence absolutely told us to do. But in Labour, we also recognised that that was one part of the picture. The second part of the picture is that there are families in poverty who are working. This government has persistently said that the way to get out of poverty is to get into work. If only that were true, Mr. Speaker. But that's not what our economy is delivering New Zealand families. 2 out of 5 families who are living in poverty are in work. Not all work is born equal in New Zealand. Not all work is decent work. Not all work means that families are free from the burden of poverty. And that is absolutely why we needed a government today who acknowledged that, who looked at the evidence from the Growing Up in New Zealand report that said that some families are working multiple jobs just to survive. In part, this bill potentially exacerbates that problem. Yes, the government is giving a bit of extra support for families in welfare, but they're also placing extra work obligations for children no longer at the age of 5, but at the age of 3. That doesn't acknowledge the reality for many of our sole parent caregivers. Finding a job is one thing, and we must point out that there is nothing in this budget about creating work. 41% of jobs in New Zealand last year were created by who? Small businesses, and they get nothing in this budget. So if you want to help families find work, help the people who create the jobs they move into. So finding jobs is one thing, but making sure that those jobs are paying decently is another. Also making sure that the hours that you find in those part-time jobs then fit in with your early childhood education care is another question entirely. Part-time work is often at hours that aren't family and child friendly. So again, we need to be realistic about the kind of environment that these parents are going to be operated in. And Labor has serious reservations about that element of the bill, and that is exactly what we'll be looking at in Select Committee. But also, Mr. Speaker, it is about the bigger picture. The evidence has always said to tackle child poverty, we need a plan. And the Children's Commissioner today, in the wake of this budget, has said this extra payment, whilst good, does not constitute a plan. A genuine plan that wants to really fix child poverty would make housing affordable. We know that the fact that some families are putting 50% of their income just to make sure they have a roof over their head, and sometimes that roof is damp and it is cold and it is crowded. We need to make sure that if we're genuinely addressing child poverty, we're making sure that housing is affordable and available to those families. That should have been part of the plan. We need to make sure that healthcare is genuinely accessible. Some of these families are experiencing such dire circumstances that even though it might be free for their child to go to the doctor, the parent who's meant to take them there has debt at their local clinic and so doesn't go because they know that they won't be able to get an appointment before paying their debt. I've heard of stories, Mr. Speaker, of families who have lost their jobs, where their kids have contracted scabies, and whilst they've managed to go and get the treatment for them, they can't even afford the hot water that is required to do the hot water wash to rid that family of that affliction. Poverty is a vicious cycle, Mr. Speaker, and it never affects just one part of a family's life. We would also have made sure, if we had a genuine plan, that we would address the hidden costs of education and make it accessible. Labor was committed and remains committed to a full whole-of-government plan. We have a bill in the ballot called the Child Poverty Reduction and Eradication Bill. It's all about making sure that the Minister of Housing, Education, Health, Social Development and Finance all have responsibility for a package that deals with child poverty. Best start for us, that $566 million package was only one part of the picture, and this bill for this government should only be one part of the picture. And one extra thing, critical difference between us and this government on child poverty: we're willing to put in place the target. We're willing to put a number to how much we're committed to reducing child poverty by. Why hasn't that government done it? Because I know from having done numbers ourselves how hard it is to genuinely lift a family out of poverty, and this measure today won't do it. It just won't. And we will report on how much we do on that target every single budget. Mr. Speaker, I leave my final words for the place where this all started for me. I talk a lot about having spent a few years as a child living in a town called Murupara. The people of Murupara who found themselves in hardship found themselves in that place ultimately because their region, their town, was dependent on forestry. And in the 80s, that industry was absolutely gutted for them. That is what ultimately drove the poverty in that town. A measure like this today won't solve that problem for the people of a town like Murupara. We need ultimately an economy that works for everyone, that gives people hope. Today, the government acknowledged we have a problem, but sadly it didn't fix it.
Call Alfred Ngaro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.